In this lecture, we're going to learn some rules on how to add and subtract positive and negative numbers. I'm going to break this into three cases. Okay? The first case is addition of two numbers having the same sign. The second case is the addition of two numbers having different signs. And the third case is just the subtraction of two numbers. So let's take case one, the addition of two numbers that have the same sign. We'll start with a couple examples. What do I mean by sign? 5 plus 2. This is a problem you probably learned how to do in the first or second grade, but it's good for this example. What I mean by the sign of the number is a number can either be a positive number or a negative number. If it's a positive number, you never see the sign positive there. If there's no sign, it's assumed that it's a positive number. But for this example, I'm going to put the little plus sign on each number to indicate that it is positive. Okay? Another example of adding two numbers that have the same sign is my signs could both be negative. In this case, we would put a negative sign in front of the numbers. So here's my case one. I have an addition of two numbers that have the same sign. In this example, they have the same sign, which are positive. In this example, they have the same sign, which is negative. Okay? The rule that we need to learn is this. What we're going to do, whenever we see the addition of two numbers with the same sign, is we are going to add the absolute value of the numbers and keep the sign. Okay? Example one, well, that one's pretty easy. You've been doing this for a long time. But let's just look at it according to my rule here. The absolute value of a 5 is 5. The absolute value of a 2 is 2. So the rule says we add the absolute values of the numbers. 5 and 2 is 7. And we keep the sign. Since both of the numbers were positive, we keep that sign to be positive. So the answer is positive 7. Okay. Similar. Let's look at this problem. Negative 5 plus a negative 2. Let's look at our rule. It says we want to add the absolute values of the numbers. And we're going to keep the sign. Again, the absolute value of a negative 5 is positive 5. The absolute value of a negative 2 is a positive 2. So we're going to add the absolute values together. We get 7. And it says that we keep the sign of the numbers. So since both of them are negative, we're going to keep the sign. So negative 5 plus negative 2 is negative 7. Let's try one more. And you'll get to the point where you don't have to find the absolute value. You'll basically do these in your head. So let's look at this one. Let's go ahead and put a parenthesis. Negative 3 plus negative 9. Okay? Again, both of my numbers are negative. So we're going to add the absolute values together. I'll just do this in my head. The absolute value of negative 3 is a positive 3. The absolute value of a negative 9 is a positive 9. And 3 and 9 is 12. And we keep the sign. Okay. So those type of problems aren't too difficult. Let's do case 2. We're going to add two numbers having different signs. Now this is the tougher of the two cases. How about negative 10 plus 7? Notice one number is negative, one number is positive. So these two numbers have different signs. And let me go ahead and put a rule down, and we'll follow our rules. When we add two numbers that have different signs, here's the rule. We want to subtract the smaller absolute value from the larger, absolute value, and keep the sign of the larger number. And I'll put that in quotes. I'll talk about that in a second. I'll give you a chance to write that down. The rule is we subtract the smaller absolute value from the larger absolute value and keep the sign of the larger number. So let's go ahead and look at this problem down here. Let's find the absolute values of these numbers. Absolute value of a negative 10 is 10. The absolute value of 7 is 7. Now, if you haven't learned about absolute value, you may want to review the lecture on absolute value first before you do these problems. Okay, let's look at the rule. We want to subtract the smaller absolute value from the larger. So we want to take 10 minus 7. And we get 3. Okay? But we want to keep the sign of the larger number. And what I mean by larger is we want to look for the larger absolute value. The larger one was this one, and the sign was negative. So when I say keep the sign of the larger number, you just look for the larger absolute value, and then we're going to keep that sign. Okay? So negative 10 plus 7 is a negative 3. Let's do a couple more examples. How about 7 plus a negative 13? Again, the rule, we want to find the absolute values. Okay? The rule was, you might want to look on your paper if you wrote it down, is we want to subtract the absolute values. So we take the 13 minus the 7, and we get 6. Now we look for the sign of the larger number. The 13 was the larger number in this case, so it's negative. One more. We need to see several of these examples. Negative 8, plus 19. Okay. Again, I'm adding a negative number to a positive number. So the rule says I need to take the absolute values. And again, eventually you'll be able to do this in your head. But let's try to get the rule down. Okay. The rule said we subtract the smaller absolute value from the larger. We get 11. Okay. And we want to keep the sign of the larger number. In this case, the 19 was the larger, which means we keep a positive number for our answer, and we never have to write the actual positive sign. Just assume that it's positive. Okay? All right. The last case was the subtraction of two numbers. Okay? Okay. And here's the rule that we're going to follow. Now, if I have a subtraction of two numbers, these letters represent numbers. If I have a minus b, I'm going to rewrite the subtraction as an addition problem. So a minus b can be written as a plus a negative b. Let's just do an example. Negative 3 minus 5. Okay, let's follow the example here. Well, my a in this case is negative 3. Okay. There's my subtraction symbol. And my b is 5. According to this rule, I can rewrite this as a negative 3 plus a negative b, in this case, a negative 5. And notice what we've come up with is now an addition problem. And we already know the rules for addition. We just add the numbers because they have the same sign and keep the sign. Okay? So we add the absolute values and keep the sign. So when we have a subtraction problem, what we really want to do is we want to change it to an addition problem and then just follow the first two rules for addition. And I'll do a couple more examples. How about negative 10 minus 13? Okay. Again, we're going to change this to an addition problem. And we'll follow our rules for addition. So now I have negative 3 plus a negative 13. We add the absolute values and keep the sign. That was the rule. Okay. One more. How about 8 minus a negative 2? Now let's refer to our rule again. A minus b is equal to a plus a negative b. So we have to change the sign on the second number. I'll write that down. A minus b is equal to a plus a negative b. So let's change this to an addition problem. My a is 8. My b is negative 2. So 8 minus a negative 2, according to my rule, is equal to 8 plus a negative b. Well, a negative 2 is going to change the sign or make that a positive 2. And 8 plus 2 is 10. Now this is obviously the trickier of the examples that I've done. So we might want to do another example that looks just like that. Then we'll summarize. How about negative 5 minus 9? Okay, I'll follow my rule. So I'll change it to an addition problem. Okay. So negative 5 plus a negative 9 is equal to, remember our rule, when I'm adding numbers with the same sign, I add the absolute value and keep the sign. Okay, let's summarize our cases. When adding two numbers that have the same sign, we add the absolute values and keep the sign. Okay? When adding two numbers that have different signs, we're going to subtract the absolute values and keep the sign of the larger number. And the subtracting is just getting a feel for changing it into an addition problem. So when we subtract two numbers, we're going to change into an addition problem following our rule, and then we're just going to use our rules for addition. You may want to review this lecture a couple times and do several problems. Once you do a handful of problems, it gets a lot easier for you. Remember, you can always see your instructor or go to your focus group leader or get some help at the tutoring center.